So good afternoon. I'll pick up where I left off earlier this morning. I have to talk about new strategies for LDL lowering, and I think Professor Blom already gave us a very elegant overview of the new drugs. So what I want to do is to give you an overview about new strategies that can be clinically relevant for statins. And these are my disclosures. There are three groups of patients that have now somewhat been ostracized as not responsive to statin or not really part of large clinical outcome trials in statins. And I'd like to show you some recent data that actually underlines that these kind of patients do have a very good response to statins, based not always on randomized controlled clinical trials, because we don't have them due to the lack of patents of statins, so it's mostly observational or retrospective studies, but quite interesting. Let's go first to heart failure. I think everybody is quite aware that the large heart failure trial, the Corona and the GC heart failure, didn't show significant results. There was no harm, but there was no clinical impact in reducing events in heart failure patients. So based on that, heart failure has somewhat been an orphan in terms of managing with cholesterol. These are the outcome trials, as you can see, 2007 and 2008, and the curves of the placebo and the treatment group almost overlap. However, based on experimental studies, animal studies, cell culture studies, we do know that statins could have an impact in metabolic features and functionality in heart failure that should be positive. So here are some of the ischemic heart failure and also in non-ischemic heart failure effects that were observed looking at treating individuals or animals with statins, and these sort of triggered people to look a step further. And one of the conclusions they came to is that maybe it's not that statins are ineffective, but maybe it's the fact that hydrophilic statins are less effective in getting the results. And one of the features of statins is not only their LDL cholesterol lowering potency, but also what we call the pleiotropic effects. And these pleiotropic effects are probably more pronounced in lipophilic statins than in hydrophilic statins. And as depicted in this slide, there's increased hepatic uptake by the liver, and there's also higher retention in cardiac tissue. So they looked at the meta-analysis of 13 trials with almost 11,000 patients, comparing lipophilic with hydrophilic statins, basically atorvastatin and rosuvastatin, and they observed that in all these endpoints there was superiority for the lipophilic atorvastatin. So atorvastatin did have an effect in patients with heart failure. This is another two meta-analysis. This is with 13 trials, 17 trials. And again, the use of atorvastatin was associated with improved outcomes. Here, left ventricular ejection fraction, reduced BNP, and also all-cause mortality and other clinical endpoints. This gives you an overview of some of the trials that were used with different types of statins. And as you can see here, the negative trials were the ones conducted with rosuvastatin, while the ones with atorvastatin, simvastatin, and this was a mixture of statins, all showed positive benefits. In this meta-analysis, they compared overall results and then making a distinction between lipophilic and hydrophilic statins in terms of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular death, and cardiovascular hospitalization. And clearly, again, the effects of atorvastatin versus rosuvastatin were superior. Now, these are not considered to be hardcore evidence-based evidence, because this is not designed as a clinical outcome trial, but the circumstantial evidence is quite convincing. And I think it is something that we should try to embrace in our clinical care to see if we do not see an improved outcome when using lipophilic atorvastatin versus hydrophilic statin. So after statins and heart failure, let's look at statins and stroke. Again, we have some very good evidence that not only in terms of biomarkers and in terms of functional differences, statins are really beneficial in patients who have ischemic stroke, but there was always a little bit of a caveat for patients who had hemorrhagic stroke. And that was based on one really large trial, the SPARKLE study, which included patients that suffered an ischemic stroke and followed them for approximately 4 to 5 years. No, it's like, let me see. I think it was 3 to 4 years, and where atorvastatin was compared to placebo. And this was atorvastatin 80 milligram. And at the end of the trial, they did observe a very elegant reduction of restrokes, and also cardiovascular endpoints were very elegantly lowered. But there was also an uptake of what we call hemorrhagic strokes. There was a slight uptake of more patients suffering bleedings compared to the ones in the placebo group who were less likely to suffer bleeds. And it does make kind of sense, because we do know that statins also have some antithrombogenic, anticoagulant effect. So that might be a mechanism why this is caused. One thing I wanted to point out as well, this is looking at tolerability, muscle-associated adverse events. And like I said, these were 80 milligram versus placebo. And if you look at all the muscle-related side effects here, there's not really a distinct difference between the placebo group and the atorvastatin group. And that is something that we observe again and again in almost all the randomized controlled clinical trials. After SPARKLE, they also looked at previous trials looking at the outcomes in total stroke or ischemic stroke. And indeed, combining all that data did show a nice 17% reduction of restrokes. These are the large trials: SPARKLE, heart protection, lipid and care study, and overall there was roughly a nice 12 to 18% reduction in restrokes. What was intriguing is indeed there was a reduction in ischemic stroke, but there was in some trials a positive sign of hemorrhagic stroke. But you can see overall this was not quite clear. It was in SPARKLE and it was in heart protection study, but not statistically significant. And if you look at the total and at the subtotal, this is looking at the two trials. So you see an uptick in hemorrhagic stroke, but overall there was hardly an uptake, and at least not statistically significant. The numbers were of course also intriguing, because there is quite a higher incidence of ischemic stroke compared to hemorrhagic stroke. So the numbers were smaller. And again, there was clearly in SPARKLE an uptick compared to what we saw with ischemic stroke. What's also interesting to observe in the SPARKLE trial was that the dose or the decrease in LDL also played an important part. If you were able to reduce your LDL with more than 50%, there was a sharp reduction in all stroke, sharp reduction in ischemic stroke, and there was, well, not really a clear effect on hemorrhagic stroke. Now, we now have some observational data, some registries, something that I underlined in the beginning that's going to be very important in managing and improving our healthcare. And this is data from a Chinese registry, 354 ischemic stroke patients with a prior cerebral hemorrhage, and their risk for having a cerebral hemorrhage was 0. There was not really an uptake. There was a reduction in hemorrhagic of ischemic stroke. Ischemic recurrence of intracerebral hemorrhage was shorter, and ischemic stroke was prolonged. However, this was not really significant, and this was highly significant. Another one, meta-analysis of 16 studies looking at outcomes in patients who had an hemorrhagic stroke and then were treated with statins because they already had statins on board, and the ones that did have the statins seemed to do better. So the sizes of the stroke affected area in the brain was smaller, and also their recovery rate was actually better. So we're now in a situation that in a region where hemorrhagic stroke is much more frequent than in our region, that there seems to be not that much of a negative effect of hemorrhagic stroke, and that there are indications that it might actually be more beneficial in terms of reducing the size of the infarct and improving the recovery. And we really didn't see a lot of negative effects like very high incidence of hemorrhagic stroke in patients who were using a statin and suffered complications. Now, last interesting feature I would like to share with you is the use of statins, not in a tablet form, but intravenously. And I want to start off by this trial that looked at the use of simvastatin in patients that were deceased. So patients died, and then they were given a nasogastric tube with simvastatin. No, they didn't wake up again, I'm sorry. It was not that successful, but these patients were used as organ donors, and they were followed, or the organs and the receivers of the organs were followed, and this is what they observed. So these were patients who were scheduled for have a heart transplant, and they seemed to have a better outcome. Let me share this with you. This is, again, for patients who had a liver transplant, and again, the patients who received the organ seem to have better outcome. This is looking at graft survival, this is looking at patient survival, and this is looking at severe complications. And in all these cases, you see that there was definitely a clinically significant better outcome by simply adding a short-term exposure to statins using a nasogastric tube. Now, IV statins are, of course, not available, but there were some interesting studies conducted with animals. And this is done with a pig study where they actually made an infarct in a pig heart and then used intravenous statin to observe what happened. So this is the design. Small study, 7 animals were exposed to intravenous statins, 7 were exposed to just a placebo. 75 minutes of ischemia, followed with the infusion, and then 15 more minutes of ischemia. And there was also a third arm that got atorvastatin as an oral tablet formulation. And this is what happened in terms of biomarkers and physiological changes. This is ischemia-modified albumin. This is cardiac fatty acid binding protein. This is myoglobulin as a marker of cardiac cell damage, and you can clearly observe is that the ones that use intravenous statins did actually better. This is looking at more clinically relevant parameters. So here you see the heart that used the intravenous statin compared to the oral statin. There was a reduced infarct size, there was a reduced scar size, and there was reduced wall motion abnormalities. So that formulation of a statin as an old, well-known, very well-available drug seems to have benefits that we're not really that aware of. In another format, this is done in a large study where they looked at early statin administration patients coming to the CCU after infarction. So they were administered oral statins very quickly to compare if that had an impact to starting statins slightly later. And what they saw is that there was definitely an effect in the ones that were given a statin. So this is looking at mortality, ischemic events, and again, there was not a real effect on hemorrhagic stroke. A slight uptick, but the confidence interval is very big. This is looking at in-hospital mortality, not early statin, moderate intensity statin, and high intensity statin. And again, it looks that high intensity statin was also superior in this formulation. So in this registry, it looked at using a statin in a different format very early in the phase could actually have pronounced effect in better survival and outcomes. And as a contrast, I'd like to share with you this study, which was evolocumab treatment in patients undergoing coronary bypass artery surgery. And what they observed here, oh no, I think I left that out because of time restraints. So what I want to do is to conclude that statins are actually still a drug that has surprising benefits, surprising effects. I do a literature search for primary prevention and cholesterol lowering and cholesterol management, and every week there's approximately 50 to 60 new articles on statins. So there is still a lot of things going on. Not all of them might be clinically relevant, but I hope that I showed you a few that could be of importance. So to conclude, for heart failure, I think lipophilic statins show more promise than the hydrophilic statins. Hemorrhagic stroke patients do not seem to be harmed by having statins on board. The signal we see is very small, but on the other hand, we see some benefits based on these pleiotropic effects that reduce infarct size and that improve outcome. IV statins showed also some surprising benefit that has not been properly tested in a well-designed trial, but I think it's intriguing. And high-intensity, high-dose statins are really fundamental in cardiovascular disease prevention and should be started as early as possible. So this was my last slide, and I think at the end of the session we have some time for questions.